And who's going to kick us off this evening?
So I am. Good evening, everyone. I am Monroe Dennis, council member and Mayor Pro Tem. We are glad to have you all here for a series in College Park's discussions. And tonight's series is particularly devoted to urban renewal, the Lakeland community, and some discussion of restorative justice. And so as some background and to kick off the program, we have a video that is about a 5-minute video, and then we'll be back with some more commentary.
Centers and fast food shops. Just take a turn onto Lakeland Road near the University of Maryland's North Gate, and you will find Lakeland. Maybe it would be truer to say the remains of Lakeland, the historic African-American community of College Park. Lakeland grew as a community during the time of segregation, 1865 to about 1970. Schools and houses were not desegregated in Prince George's County until very late. Then there was white flight, but those stories are for another day. Lakeland was a vibrant place with boundaries that reached from just behind the east side of US 1 across the B&O railroad tracks to include what is now Lake Artemisia Natural Area. It was a place of extended families where nearly everyone was related. These ties made it natural for people to work together to meet all types of needs, including care of the old and the young. There were homes, some large and others more modest, with huge vegetable gardens, schools, churches, a social hall, lodge building, stores, beauty shops, and baseball fields. Lakeland was a place where people lived, loved, and celebrated.
So, what happened?
Urban renewal happened.
In the 1960s, Lakelanders, like many other Black residents across the nation, worked to exercise community control over their neighborhoods in resistance to housing discrimination. Following the passage of federal legislation with the promise of addressing housing inequalities, residents petitioned the city of College Park for help. The community organized in hopes of protecting some of their homes from frequent flooding, alleviating the impacts of flooding in the area, and helping some improve their homes. In 1969, residents, city and county officials, and stakeholders compromised on a redevelopment plan and officially made Lakeland a designated site for urban renewal. Although the federal policies were intended to improve lives of disenfranchised residents, the stories of Lakelanders who lived through this period reflect the destruction and transformation of Lakeland's landscape and community. Many family homes had been built in what government experts said were flood-prone areas. Many others were judged to be blight. In the end, 104 of Lakeland's 150 households were marked for demolition. By the end of the 1970s, most of Lakeland's residents were forced to leave, and 2/3 of the land was cleared. Gone is the western part of Lakeland with its homes, the American Legion Post, social hall, and stores. After standing vacant for years, it was all replaced. Gone is the eastern part of Lakeland, its historic Rosenwald School building and homes with their gardens. Gone are so many Lakeland families. Was there harm to Lakelanders? What does restorative justice mean for this community?
Today, we Lakelanders are calling upon our city leaders to make good on their promise to aggressively seek opportunities for restorative justice.
We must come together as a government and community and allow Lakelanders to speak out about the wrong done, the harm it caused, and set roads to restoration.
Our vision is a building block for a Lakeland which is strong, healthy, safe, and inclusive.
Although a great deal has been lost, Lakeland's story reflects the larger story of the African American experience in Prince George's County, as well as the larger struggles for racial equality in our nation.
While we should always be inspired by the resiliency of Lakeland's generations of residents, the neighborhood's history should cause us to question which histories are truly valued and why.
Now that you've heard Lakeland's story, we hope to see you soon.
And now the next voice you should hear should be our mayor, Mayor Woyan, to give some comments, acknowledgements, and then we will proceed with the rest of the program. Mayor Woyan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Dennis, and thank you to the Lakeland Community Heritage Project for that powerful video and that powerful call for the city of College Park to act to redress the wrongs of the past. I want to start by reading, it was in the beginning of the video, but I want to read what we have committed to as a city, in particular regarding Lakeland. There is a resolution that we passed last June that is up on the city's website at collegeparkmd.gov/Black Lives Matter that I encourage everyone to read in its entirety. But I do want to read specifically the provisions in here relating to the Lakeland community. A whereas provision where it states, whereas past practice and policy of the city of College Park have systemically disadvantaged Black residents and the historically Black community of Lakeland. And then one of the resolved clauses where it states, resolved, there it is. Resolved that the mayor and council acknowledge and apologize for our city's past history of oppression, particularly with regard to the Lakeland community, and actively seek opportunities for accountability and truth-telling about past injustice, and aggressively seek opportunities for restorative justice. And it is in that spirit and with that goal that we have organized the event this evening to begin and further the discussion. This is furthering on 3 events that we held last year in 2020 around racial justice and equity in College Park and generally, but this is the first of these events that we are holding specifically to further the discussion on the Lakeland community and begin the discussion of how we pursue restorative justice in College Park relating to the Lakeland community. So I want to thank and acknowledge everybody who is here this evening for this event, to participate in this conversation. But I want to especially acknowledge the Lakeland Community Heritage Project, Maxine Gross, the Lakeland Civic Association, Robert Thurston, and the members of the Lakeland community who have contributed to the conversation that led up to these events. I also want to thank our city staff, in particular our Director of Youth, Family, and Senior Services, Kaisha Barber, our Director of Public Services, Bob Ryan, our Acting City Manager, Bill Gardner, for being part of the planning of this and putting this together, as well as our work group with the City Council, which includes, in addition to myself, council members, Mayor Pro Tem Monroe Dennis, council members Denise Mitchell, Letitra Esters, and Robert Day. for the planning of this together. I also want to acknowledge the other city council members who have joined us this evening. Councilmember John Rigg, Councilmember Kate Kennedy, Councilmember Fazal Kabir, and Councilmember Maria Mackey. And I also see that we're joined this evening by one of our county council members, Danielle Glaros. Thank you everybody for joining us and for all of your engagement on these efforts. With that, we have a very esteemed panel of speakers this evening, who I also want to thank for joining us. And we also have joining us as an attendee, former county council member and current director of the College Park City University Partnership, Eric Olson. I'm sure we have other folks. There's a lot of other people joining us, I see, in the attendees. So I appreciate everybody for joining us this evening. With that, to introduce our panel and begin the conversation, I'll turn it back to Mr. Dennis.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And as I believe I also saw in the attendee list, former council member and former mayor Andy Fellows. And so want to acknowledge former Mayor Fellows. And a bit of housekeeping before we get started with the discussion. We hope that we will have a very vigorous and engaging discussion centered around the questions. And so there may or may not be a time to get to some audience questions, but we've tried to make arrangements for that by, as you see on your screens now, on our screens now, there's an email address, families@collegeparkmd.gov, where you may submit questions. Someone who is helping us monitor this program will be able to filter through those, and if there's time, answer some of them. But we do hope, and we will expect that we'll get answers, responses to any of those questions after the forum at a later date. And so I'm now waiting for technology to allow me to get to the bios for our panelists, and just bear with me for a second. I do have it on my screen. Here we are. All right, so not necessarily in any order, but we have, and I believe you've all met Dr. Johanna Turner, who is Assistant Professor of Restorative Justice and Peace Building at the Center for Justice and Peace Building. For over 15 years, she has worked as part of arts collectives, community organizing coalitions, and other social movement organizations to develop youth leadership, to empower disenfranchised people, and to cultivate transformational approaches to safety and justice. And Dr. Turner is currently an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland. Welcome again, Dr. Turner. Next, as our panelist, we have Dr. Kurt Rhodes, or as he asked us to refer to him as Kurt, and I will do that as we go forward. Kurt is the founder, international director of Quest Scope, a nonprofit, non-governmental organization established in 1988 for youth mentorship, alternative education, juvenile justice, community-based health, and humanitarian aid programs that foster social development among disadvantaged youth and women, and particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. And as we go throughout the program, you'll see how our major subject areas of discussion will be germane to some of the bio that we've given, and some of the intersection or cross section of the discussion. Then we also have Dr. Willow Lungomam, Associate Professor of Urban Studies and Planning and Director of Community Development at the National Center for Smart Growth, also at the University of Maryland here in College Park. And finally, we have Maxine Gross, whom you've all met. Maxine is a fifth generation Lakelander and founding member of the aforementioned Lakeland Community Heritage Project. Maxine's history of community service includes time as Lakeland Civic Association president and as a council member. Ms. Gross is a graduate of the University of Maryland here in College Park and holds a master's degree from Bowie State. And going back to our program order and to our questions, Ms. Gross will be responding to the first question, that is, what is the history of Lakeland and its relationship to College Park? And accompanying Ms. Gross's discussion, she will have a PowerPoint that should be queued up and ready to go now. So Ms. Gross.
Good evening. I'm going to begin tonight by giving you a short history of Lakeland and the city of College Park. A lot of the material was already covered through the short video, but there are a few points that I think need to be amplified upon. If you would like at some point to get more information about the history of Lakeland, I encourage you to take a look at a short picture book, Lakeland African Americans in College Park. It's available at general booksellers. Lakeland was founded around 1890 in an area where others wished not to live because the land was prone to flooding and was also marshy. And until the 1970s, Lakeland was the only place in the city of College Park where African Americans were welcome to live. By 1903, Lakeland had become an established community with 2 churches and a school. Over the next generations, the community grew with more homes and new schools, businesses, and social organizations. Community members worked together to raise children, care for the old, and build a safe, self-contained community. There were forces, however, that were working against Lakelanders. They were surrounded by other communities that were overwhelmingly white. And as Blacks, only poor paying jobs were open to them, and they did not have access to regulated mortgages. These forces impacted the style and modernity of the homes that Lakelanders were able to build. Lakeland was a proud community of people who worked together to make the best of the life that they could. Here's an article from the Baltimore Sun, dated February 1945. It describes the opposition of Lakelanders to being included in the new city boundaries for College Park. As the article states, Lakelanders understood the economics of their situation would put them at a disadvantage should they become part of the new city. Soon after the birth of College Park, the new city did a housing study. It judged Lakeland to be a detriment to College Park because of its low home values. Remember, as African Americans, Lakelanders were disadvantaged. They couldn't get good paying jobs. And even as far as into the 1960s, they didn't have opportunities to gain regulated mortgages. Let's see. Finding Lakeland to be a detriment was actually penalizing Lakelanders for something that society had inflicted upon them. Just after becoming part of the city and being found to be a detriment to the city of College Park, discussions began about what to do about Lakeland. Lakelanders engaged in these conversations because they were concerned about the flooding that plagued the area from Rhode Island Avenue to Route 1. And their goal in those discussions was to just get help to alleviate the flooding. Over a period of decades, conversations continued, and eventually the city came upon the decision to make application for an urban renewal plan. That plan was made in 1969. The plan was something that most Lakelanders were concerned about. The residents had, as I said, engaged for a long period of time in conversation. And ultimately, the city's plan called for the redevelopment of the majority of Lakeland, the area from Rhode Island Avenue to Route 1, and also the area east of the railroad tracks. In that plan was seen by most Lakelanders as concerning, something they didn't particularly want to happen, but many felt that it was the only option they had in order to alleviate the flooding problem. Other Lakelanders remained, however, vehemently opposed to urban renewal because they felt that it was only a mechanism to gain the land from African Americans and also a way to destroy their community. So in the mid-1970s, many Lakelanders were forced to leave their community. Urban renewal displaced about 104 of 150 Lakeland families. Before many of the houses were torn down, they were burned by the local volunteer fire department as practice, while the auxiliary of the fire department made a day trip of watching the fires. Then the houses were torn down. The remains of those homes remained in Lakeland for nearly a decade. Given the geography of Lakeland, those people who remained in the community were forced to drive by or walk past the remains of most of their community on a daily basis. This is a quote from a Lakelander about urban renewal. You see, the plan changed. After the Lakelanders had been required to leave their homes, the city at that point really had no firm arrangements for rebuilding the community. They were changing plans, and they were going to different builders to rebuild the community. That took a lot of time. And this is a quote from the Washington Post, where one Lakelander was talking about the plan at that point for Lakeland, and just making known the fact that Lakelanders were clear that the homes or the places that were being built were not for them, that they were for other people outside of the community, and that the needs of Lakelanders were not being addressed. This is what Lakeland looked like for a number of years. At the end of urban renewal, I need to help you make a comparison for you. The yellow shows Lakeland prior to urban renewal. It was a community of homes primarily owned by African Americans. There were a few landlords from other parts of the area. This is what remains of Lakeland, the yellow there. The majority of Lakeland is now owned by Maryland National Park and Planning Commission, Board of Education, and the true winner of urban renewal, Leon Weiner and Associates. These were some of the promises that weren't kept to urban renewal. Urban renewal was to take place over a course of 5 years, from the time that the Lakelanders were to leave their homes until they were to move back into permanent homes. The clearance and redevelopment process was to be staged in such a way as to allow families to remain in the community, simply moving from one area of Lakeland and to another, and then back into newer homes. The project was to protect the vitality, scale, and environmental quality of Lakeland. Also, the redevelopment of service commercial buildings that stood in the community was to take place. So those are some of the things that happened. That helps you to understand a little bit about the story of the city of College Park and the community of Lakeland.
Okay, thank you, Maxine, for that that history of the Lakeland and the Lakeland community and its relationship to College Park. And to continue with some urban renewal specific discussion, I will now turn to Dr. Willow Lungamam, who will describe what she would call an urban renewal initiative. And as we said earlier, Dr. Lungamam has had experience here in the College Park community. So with that, I will turn this over to Dr. Willow Lungamam. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here, and thanks to the City of College Park for this broader initiative around the Lakeland community. I am both a professor of the University of Maryland and a student of the University of Maryland's Urban Studies and Planning program, and have long known about the history of the Lakeland community. And I think it is a long time coming that such a history be more widely known, celebrated, and rectified across the city. So I'm very happy that Ms. Gross asked me to be here today to be a part of this conversation. So before I go and start with the sort of technical definition of urban renewal and thinking about the broader impacts of urban renewal in our region and how it hit ground in Lakeland in particular, I just wanted to add to a little bit to the history that Ms. Gross already shared to give a little bit more context around sort of where Lakeland sits in the larger region. It's important to know that Lakeland was originally planned as a community for white Washingtonians near Lake Artemisia, that it was a resort, seen as a resort town. But when African Americans who largely worked at the University of Maryland began moving into the area because it was along the 82 streetcar line and was convenient to work, many whites began to leave the area, fleeing the area. In fact, some even burned their homes as they fled the Lakeland area. So like many Black suburbs and Black neighborhoods around the DMV, this neighborhood was subject to violent practices around its making that continued, and those kind of restrictive as well as the violence that surrounded the Lakeland community was a part of its history as well, and why African Americans congregated in these particular neighborhoods. There were violent groups throughout Brentwood and throughout many of the Prince George's County communities. And so there were only so many neighborhoods in which African Americans could live. And like Lakeland, many of those communities where African Americans could live, where they were not subject to restrictive housing practices and the violence of the communities outside of them, were often in flood-prone areas. They were often in areas that repeatedly flooded, where the community repeatedly went to the counties and cities and asked for flood protection, and oftentimes did not receive them. So this is also the story of North Brentwood and so many other communities, Black communities, historically Black communities in Prince George's County. So I think that's really important to remember of sort of thinking of Lakeland in the context of so many other African-American cities and towns that managed to survive very harsh conditions prior to urban renewal coming to town. Many of them did not survive in Montgomery and Prince George's County from the various types of pressures and restrictive practices. And oftentimes the lack of development dollars that went into these neighborhoods. And Lakeland was one of the few neighborhoods that did survive up until the 1950s. And for many, so urban renewal was a product really of the 1949 Housing Act. This is a federal housing act that was really revolutionary in its time, in that it's devoting a large number of federal dollars and giving a lot of powers to local municipalities around the issue of slum clearance. Prior to the passage of the 1949 Housing Act, you have a lot of local municipalities trying to deal with quote unquote slum conditions of dilapidated housing, of unsanitary housing through local mechanisms. But in the 1940s, you get this big push of federal dollars. And what it allows local municipalities to do is to start redevelopment agencies that are given greater authority and funding to purchase and clear lands that are deemed quote unquote blighted. And that designation of blight is really a contested one, because what areas are oftentimes designated as blighted are oftentimes African-American neighborhoods, oftentimes have as much to do with race as they do with actual housing conditions. In many urban neighborhoods like DC, this is also compounded by other housing and other federal acts that allow for widespread clearance of urban neighborhoods. So you have this sort of intersecting with the interstate highway passage of several interstate highway acts that give federal dollars for large interstate highways coming through cities and suburbs, and those oftentimes being directed through African-American neighborhoods in a process that many called Negro removal. So you have the highway clearance and the authority of local redevelopment agencies to be able to purchase this land, and then hand it over to private developers to redevelop the land. So you often see this in DC, resulting in widespread clearance of downtown areas like the Central Business District of downtown, or even wholesale redevelopment of entire neighborhoods, like the Southwest neighborhood of Washington, DC, in which 99% of residents were relocated out of their neighborhoods, and barely any of those neighborhood residents were able to come back. And again, largely African-American were the subject of displacement. And also, when residents were relocated, they were oftentimes relocated into public housing further concentrating racial segregation and racialized disadvantage in Black neighborhoods. So the history of Lakeland is a little bit different because it happens inside a suburb, and typically we think about urban renewal as largely affecting urban neighborhoods. But as I'm writing currently on a book project, and I think many scholars recognize today, urban renewal was not something that just happened in cities. It also happened in suburbs. And it was not something that just happened to African-American neighborhoods. As we're learning in Lakeland today, it is also something that African-American neighborhoods like Lakeland actively fought for, in part because there was such a lack of development dollars that were going into African-American neighborhoods. There was a lack of housing dollars to be able to fix up housing. It's the same reason why some African-American communities fought for public housing, because that was one of the only kind of investments they could get into housing in their neighborhoods when these were neighborhoods that were redlined from other federal and divested from other federal and local municipal programs for housing. So it became a way of fixing a structural problem that was sort of in the makings of Lakeland because of its location in a flood-prone area. Again, like so many other African-American neighborhoods, and the fact that it didn't have a lot of other dollars going into it to fix up the housing. And so then we see the long history that Ms. Gross has so eloquently laid out, in which this program that has the potential to radically reshape and rebuild a flood-prone area for African Americans becomes the very tool of their displacement. And so you see that homes were systematically undervalued, city mismanagement, federal bureaucracy, and opposition from white College Park residents ultimately led to the very many project delays that stretched the project out over 15 years and ultimately led to the displacement of those 104 Lakeland families. But I would also say that protest from folks like in the Lakeland community is also what ultimately ended the urban renewal program in 1971. And so you have Lakeland's plans coming in 1969. It's really the end, towards the end of the urban renewal period, which really is a 1950s and 60s sort of period of massive government funding. But then after that, you see the ripple effects in the kinds of federal and municipal agencies that sort of take over some of those responsibilities, but also you see the impacts in terms of private developers that benefited from urban renewal and still benefit today.
Thank you, Dr. Lungamam. And as I was listening to you and also listening earlier to Ms. Gross, there is lots of information that is being provided here. So I just want to remind our audience also of two things. We've said these before. One, if you have questions or comments, send an email up to families@collegeparkmd.gov. Ms. Barbara showed that email link earlier. And then maybe we'll put it in the chat. I believe that all of our attendees can see the chat. And then also many of the slides and the video information that you've seen is in the Lakeland Community Heritage Project website. And I'll say that again, lakelandchp.com. So thank you again. And we're going to proceed with our program now, and we'll talk about the impact of urban renewal on the community. And also we'll talk about the impact of urban renewal on individuals and individual families. And we have Dr. Kurt Rhodes, and we have Maxine Gross to talk about the first part of that question, impact on urban renewal on the individual and families. And maybe I could put these two questions together and also ask if either one or both would talk about the impact of urban renewal on the community. And so Kurt and Maxine, you're up next. And I'll also say that depending on time, if there are some other panelists whose some of the discussion has sparked a particular question or thought, if you raise your hands, we might be able to recognize you and come back to you. But at any rate, Kurt and Maxine on impact of urban renewal on individual, families, and then the community.
I think I'll take a quick stab at that first, if I may, Kurt.
Thank you. Good.
I'm going to take a stab at it by basically telling you that I'm not going to give you an answer. I can't seek to speak for all of Lakelanders. I can't tell you what the impact of those things were. But I can kind of ask you some questions. You know, how would you feel if your community was destroyed? I mean, how would you feel if you, even as a child, I'll speak for myself, you watched your parents go to meetings night after night, week after week, month after month, and you saw them and the other adults around you become increasingly worried and talking constantly about this thing that was happening to their homes. Lakelanders, I'm going to tell you, were not passive in the process. They went to meetings, they discussed, they fought. I mean, you'll even go back as far as Lakeland becoming part of the city of College Park. You're talking about working class people who went out and hired a civil rights lawyer to fight being included in College Park because they knew it wasn't going to be a good thing for them, that they were going to be put at even further disadvantage, being governed by a city that was not really concerned about their needs. What does it mean to live in a location where the people around you, the rest of the city, they have paved streets, but you go home and you don't have paved streets. The streets, all the streets in Lakeland weren't paved until after urban renewal in the 1970s. I mean, what does it mean to live in a city where you know that you can only live in one place, and then you open up a grant report that says in 1969, people can be displaced from Lakeland because they were free to move into other areas of the city? A lie. I mean, I think several people here from are on today who lived in the community, in other communities of College Park in the 1970s can tell you about a cross burning that took place. So, you know, what does that do to a person? What does it do to a family to have to leave their home of 5 generations in an environment where not only do they know the neighbors across the street, but their grandparents know each other, grew up together? What does it mean to have to start over when you don't want to? So, you know, those are some of the questions I would ask. I think, you know, Kurt can give you some more concrete things, but I would just ask you those questions.
And let me, if I could chime in before Kurt, I would say, Ms. Gross, Maxine, you mentioned that you may not be able to provide a lot more history, but I do believe you have provided, as you said, thought-provoking questions, and some of these questions are behind, you know, some of the thoughts behind that original, or not original, but our resolution that took place in the summer, and is the impetus of some of this discussion. And so I'm sure you realize, I hope you realize, even though you say you can't provide history, you've provided thought-provoking questions, which I believe are important to this conversation, because as we, as a city and as a community, go forward with these initiatives and discussions, these are some of the things that have to be considered. And I'll get off my soapbox now and ask Kurt to speak on urban renewal, individual and family perspectives.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Maxine. Every time I talk to you, something inside me weeps, and something inside me is amazed at the courage that you and others exhibit and demonstrate, and I sit in honor of it. 40 years of my life has been spent working with displaced communities of people, usually displaced by war, but not only war, also by poverty, and decisions of other people that took away their choice. So I will just try to give us a couple of pairs of glasses to look at this situation that Maxine has described so well, and that the picture book, as you called it, of Lakeland documents so deeply. I want to talk about a theory of change. And it appears to me that the apparent theory of change was that urban renewal was about houses. The real theory of change was about land and destruction of communities. So I want to talk about the theory of change, that what could have been, to guide us in thinking about what could be. So if we could turn the clock back, or be like Superman and fly around the world in the opposite direction so that time goes back, we would want to have a better community, and that would include, of course, better land infrastructure for houses. But it would also include sustaining networks, the businesses. Today we talk about walkable communities. Well, Lakeland was a walkable community, places where people know each other, where there's employment and employers, and you have increased and not decreased opportunities in the middle of amazing economic pressures. And economic pressures are invisible pressures. They keep you from having a job that you could repair your house. They keep you from having the opportunity to make a decision. So if our theory of change was a good theory of change, we would expect that urban renewal would pay attention to sustaining the networks that existed. And urban renewal in the new world that we're envisioning could envision the kinds of services that we need to sustain. I understood from the stories that I read and the pictures that I saw and the discussions that I had, that there was a remarkable ability to generate schools in Lakeland, and remarkable talent, and very strong volunteerism and a volunteer spirit. If we were going to do a good theory of change, we would pay attention to those kinds of services. In other words, I'm trying to describe the positive side of the negatives, so that we can think with all of these, the potential for a theory of change that will take us in a positive direction. Another one is, what kind of economy do we want to sustain? One of the problems in urban gentrification is it becomes impossible for people who lived there to stay living there. But what helps people when they get into this twilight zone, when they get renewed? Is it a credit union? Is it grants to keep your home? So a good theory of change would say we want a better neighborhood, which includes envisioning the kind of economy that would sustain it. Another thing that we would pay attention to in a good theory of change for building a better community is what kind of mechanisms reflect ownership rights. It's just astonishing that people's homes can be taken for no compensation. They can be taken for, essentially in America, the biggest investment any family usually makes is in the value of their homes. So we would pay attention to the mechanisms that reflect ownership rights. And we would make sure that people have a say in house replacement or repair. The last two is speed and accountability. When you take away people's homes, you gotta make the change really fast. Otherwise, they become internal refugees in their own country. They become internally displaced people who depend on the kindness or the vagaries of fate. If we were going to think positively about a positive theory of change, we would think about speed and accountability to those people in that area. The last one is probably the particularly in displaced communities in the Middle East, and particularly with young people. The last one is the most important. Any forced displacement, the first thing that is lost is the network of relationships. That goes, and it happens to be the invisible thing. Once you break those relationships through forced displacement, then I'm stuck with another set of questions like Maxine brought to us. Where do I belong? Who do I belong to? If we are going to think about a positive theory of change, we would think, how are we going to build rather than tear down human capital? How are we going to build rather than tear down social capital? And at its base, social capital says, I have somebody to turn to, and somebody can turn to me, and we'll stick together. That's it. So these are maybe 6 or 7 thoughts that I had, and as I was thinking about, we need to introduce a new theory of change. I was struck by the first set of young people who said Lakeland was going in one direction, and then urban renewal happened. You get the wrong theory of change, you get the wrong change. I think it's possible to undo some things, and we have some other discussions coming up later. But we really need to consider that the positive side of these negatives. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, okay? This is not a new thought for you, but I wanted to add my comments about the increase of trust that's required and the increase of freedom, which allows people to make choices.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rhodes, Kurt. More food for thought or thought-provoking discussion. And I'm going to go back. The next question in our line of questioning would have been for Maxine. What was the impact of urban renewal on the community? Maybe you answered that. So if I may, I would like to go now to Dr. Willow Langamam again with a discussion of impact of urban renewal on the wider community municipality some of which you might have covered earlier, but at any rate, I'll give you an opportunity to say more if you'd like to.
Sure. I don't know if I'll speak directly to the city of College Park, but more so following up on the last presentation to sort of the impacts of urban renewal more broadly on the ground in African American communities where it largely took place. Obviously, the impacts were on some of those emotional social bonds and networks that helped to sustain African American neighborhoods. They were also on the economic impacts of displacement for African American residents who lost jobs, who lost businesses, who lost access to many of the amenities of their neighborhoods that helped to sustain them. And these were also health impacts, right? So there's a great book that I would recommend everybody read called Root Shock by Mindy Fuller-Love. And it's how tearing up urban neighborhoods hurt Americans. And it talks about like the actual physical stresses in our bodies of displacement. And so I think it's important to think about this not as just a social or economic, but actually a physical impact on what this tearing down of urban neighborhoods actually did. But also there's the economic cost of sustaining oneself elsewhere, right? So these are places where people, as Ms. Gross already said, began to own homes, right? Began to gain an economic foothold in a place, and that was largely lost. And what happened to many African Americans is people went, in many African American neighborhoods, people went from being homeowners to renters, right? In new places where they're not gaining an economic foothold in their neighborhood. And now you're seeing the impact of these neighborhoods now being gentrified, and the housing values begin to escalate in these same neighborhoods where African Americans were displacing. And so we've seen the wealth gap begin to grow in many places. And I think that has a direct link to urban renewal. And so I think the impacts are many. And I think you have to think about who was most impacted in these cases, and what is owed to those who have suffered so many multiple and recursive impacts of urban renewal.
Thank you. And I believe that in my mind, you've introduced an idea that some of us on mayor and council and some of the others here in the city have talked about, and that is the idea of housing, affordable housing, as well as even today, trying to maintain the nature of the current community, even as we go forward. And then the other thing that I will say that you have sort of introduced is what we're going to talk about next a little bit is restorative justice, and what some of the ideas of things that might be done to try to reconcile some of the harms of the past. And so hopefully I'm keeping my thoughts in line and keeping the discussion flow going. And so thank you, Dr. Lungamam. And I will now, but we'll turn to Dr. Johanna Turner, who will begin our discussion for tonight of philosophy of restorative justice and what a restorative justice process might involve, as well as what kinds of outcomes might a successful restorative justice process produce. And that's just the start of discussion of restorative justice. So Dr. Turner, please.
Thank you, Councilman Dennis. I'm really thankful to be here with you all. I teach restorative justice and peace building at Eastern Mennonite University in Virginia. And I also direct the Restorative Justice Institute there. It's called the Zaire Institute for Restorative Justice. I attended the University of Maryland in College Park for my graduate studies and had the opportunity to first learn about what happened to Lakeland when I was there as a student. I continue to be inspired by the work of Lakeland residents and the descendants of displaced residents. And I'm especially excited about this initiative, not only because of the importance of these efforts in Prince George's County, but I also think it's important for our entire nation right now, and in fact, for our entire world. And as Councilman Dennis shared, my comments will focus on what is restorative justice, what does a restorative justice process involve, and what kinds of outcomes might a restorative justice process produce. And I'll spend most of my time on that first question of what is restorative justice, because I think in answering that question, it in many ways will speak to the others, although I will touch on those a bit as well. Restorative justice is one way of responding to the question of what is justice, right? So it's a philosophy that answers that question. And there's different ideas about what justice entails. And it's particularly focused on, when we think about that question of what is justice, particularly in the aftermath of harm or hurt to individuals or entire groups and communities. Our dominant idea of justice tells us that when we are hurt, that justice is punishment, or that when we hurt others, that justice is punishment. Restorative justice as a philosophy emphasizes that justice is experienced when the needs that arise from a situation of harm are met. Restorative justice is a philosophy that emphasizes healing and accountability to repair harm and wrongdoing, to build community and to strengthen relationships. So I'm going to break that down a little bit by talking about 4 key shifts that are involved in moving from kind of the mainstream ideas about justice that we're often taught and that are much more kind of front and center in our society, to a restorative philosophy or paradigm of justice. And the first shift is a shift from the concept of crime to harm, or a shift from kind of a focus on the rules that are broken to a focus on the people and relationships that are harmed. And that harm can be physical, it could be physical injury, it could be material. Someone takes something from us or damages something that belongs to us. Harm can be emotional, an injury to our emotions. It can be spiritual, it can be relational, an injury to relationships and positive connection. So restorative justice helps to focus our attention on who is harmed, right? And that harm has happened and that people and relationships have been harmed. The second shift that restorative justice makes to our concept of justice, our understanding of justice, is it shifts us from a focus on blame to needs. And so with a kind of a mainstream approach, which we often call that a retributive lens, we usually see that a key process of justice is figuring out who is to blame. With the restorative lens, a key part of the justice process is figuring out what are the needs that have been created as a result of the harm that was done. And the idea here is that when people and relationships are harmed, needs are created. And some of the common needs that arise when we experience harm are safety and security, especially when our safety is threatened. Restitution. So for example, if something was taken from us, if that's returned, right? That's a need that we often have. Information or answers, something happens to us, we wanna know, why did that happen to me? And oftentimes the only people who can answer that question are those responsible. We often also have a need for opportunities to speak and to be heard. We need to have an opportunity to say our piece, to say how something has impacted us. And another common need is an acknowledgement of the wrong done to us. If someone has hurt you or done, whether that's an individual or a group of individuals or an entity, an institution, you want there to be some acknowledgement of what happened and to say that that was wrong. And then we also often have this common need for involvement in what happens next, not just for someone else to get to decide, but if I'm impacted, I want to be able to say what would help to meet my needs or what would help to have me experience a sense of justice and healing. And those responsible for harm also have needs. We often, when we hurt others, we often want to take some responsibility. We sometimes need support, right, for how to do that. Healthy connection with others, we want that. We often also need a kind of involvement in what happens next as well. And that could that's not only for individuals, but also institutions. And so when I say needs, I'm referring to what is necessary for healing, what is necessary to have an experience of justice. What will give us an experience that things have been put as right as possible. We know it doesn't take it away, what happened. So just to summarize, the second kind of two shifts, the third is the shift from punishment to responsibilities. So the idea here is simply that needs created by harm lead to a set of responsibilities, and the restorative justice creates opportunities for those who are especially responsible to take responsibility, right? And to take some leadership in making things right. And it emphasizes that accountability is something that's active. It can be transformative rather than passive. And then finally, the last shift is really from administration of pain to healing. We're typically often trained to think about justice as administering pain to those who have caused others pain. And so unlike that approach, the central responsibility of restorative justice is to heal. And in fact, with this approach, I would say that justice is healing. A restorative justice process brings people together who've been impacted by harm and people who have caused harm. And they bring them together along with other impacted parties to address the harm and pursue healing together. And so a process would involve those who've been harmed, have an opportunity to share how they've been impacted. They can also share what their needs are, what needs were created as a result of the harms. Those who are responsible have an opportunity to acknowledge the harm and the impacts, and they can also share what they're willing to do to address those harms. A facilitator or a set of facilitators, ideal to have more than one, will guide the process and also some shared decision-making around what will happen to move things forward in the best way possible, so that there can be some agreements that are made as to what will happen next. There's a number of different kinds of processes, such as peacemaking circles, community conferences, truth and reconciliation processes in which these take place. And I believe you'll hear more about the latter from others. There's no limit to the kinds of creative outcomes a restorative justice process can produce. And I'd just like to share an example from the work of the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project, which is based at the Northeastern University School of Law. This is a project that uses restorative justice as a framework to address violations of civil rights that occurred between 1930 and 1970. And they particularly focus on bringing a restorative justice approach to racially motivated killings, especially lynchings, but not only that. For example, in response to the killing of six different Black men in Mobile, Alabama in the 1940s, the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project, they brought together descendants of the men who were killed with the city of Mobile and the city's history museum to commemorate them and to reflect on their lives. So some of the things that that resulted from this process was an exhibition featuring materials that were associated with the investigations that happened more contemporarily. A street was dedicated to one of the men who was killed. They had a marker around about what happened to the 6 men and these restorative justice efforts. The police chief of the city publicly apologized to the families, 3 of whom lost their lives to law enforcement officers. And this is an example that's featured on the website of that organization, the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project. Restorative justice policies can yield reparations in the form of land return and other forms, changes in policies, public memorialization. And in fact, the outcomes are shaped and envisioned most significantly by those who experience the harm, whether that's directly and indirectly. Some of the impacts of those outcomes would be repair and the healing of historical harms. And I would say overall that addressing historical harms, in which this work is a part of, is really a growing area of focus in restorative justice. It recognizes that events or circumstances that cause trauma or wounding to entire social groups, that the impacts of those are passed on from generation to generation. It's not only something that happened in the past, but the impacts are passed, continue today. And Ms. Gross and Dr. Lungaman and Dr. Rhodes spoke to some of those impacts, relational impacts, economic impacts, and health impacts. And so efforts to address historical harms, they recognize that these impacts still continue, and so a long-term impact of a restorative justice process will lead to transformation in those areas as well as in other areas. I'll stop there for now.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Turner. And again, thought-provoking, lots of food for thought, and lots of information. And I want to just pivot for a second. I see Kurt, Dr. Rhodes, you have your hand raised. Did you have a question or a comment relative to something that has been said by someone else? Or because, and the reason I phrased it that way is because you are up next with Maxine to talk about restorative justice as it applies to Lakeland. So,
no, I didn't. I shouldn't have raised my hand. Rather than I was trying to look at the chat, and I must have hit the hand. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's no problem. But at any rate, so you and Maxine are up next, and I'll let you flip coins as to who goes first this time.
Maxine,
the question is, how would restorative justice apply to Lakeland per se?
Well, I guess the biggest thing I would say is that Lakelanders have been having some informal discussions over the last several months and have talked about what restorative justice or what concrete actions they feel would be necessary in order to help not only the Lakeland community move forward in a healthier fashion, but the wider community as well. And we've talked about a similar process as to what Dr. Turner has just expressed. And in fact, I've spoken before this body, encouraging them to begin with a Restorative Justice Commission to work with individuals like Dr. Turner to design a process and put it into practice for the city and Lakelanders and the wider community. But I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I did a lot of talking about the emotional kind of concerns that Lakelanders have about urban renewal and the relationship with the city of College Park. But I also want to make clear that there were economic economic impacts as well. While the city did pay something for homes that were taken by the urban renewal process, business opportunities and the impact of home ownership were things that were not, that were lost by residents of Lakeland. One of the stated goals for urban renewal was to move as many people as possible into public housing. It wasn't to support people in home ownership, but to move them into public housing. And I would also point out that that value is really spoken to today in the fact that Lakeland holds the vast majority of the public housing in the city of College Park. And it placed land that was owned by individual Black homeowners into the hands of a corporation who specialized in urban renewal and Section 8 housing throughout the country. So I think those issues of economic opportunity is something that need to be on the forefront as we talk about what does restorative justice mean and what might be the outcome of a restorative justice process. But again, I think the process is part of the healing. I think that is a key for Lakelanders. And I thank you, Dr. Turner, for saying that. I think sometimes when you hear that from an expert, it has a different weight than it does from an everyday citizen.
Maxine is a hard act to follow. One of the things that comes to mind in listening to Maxine is that restorative justice is going to have to restore trust also. And I think trust is built on two pillars. One of them is trust means that I am sure that you will not harm me intentionally. But I also have to be sure that you will not harm me unintentionally. The reason I mention these two pillars is that, to go back to some of the comments from Dr. Turner, that restorative justice really needs somebody. Will you listen to my story? Will you listen to my narrative? Will you really hear me? Will you hear what I think happened? And the second one is, there's multiple effects that resonated down the years, which Maxine pointed out very clearly: the loss of business opportunities, the loss of home ownership, I would say the loss of educational opportunities. The whole story is filled with loss. And the third point, after listening to our narratives, this recognizing the multiple effects, can we work with you for the lessons that need to be learned? Because you can take the wrong lesson. So these, to me, are critical positions for going into the kind of sequences that Dr. Turner is talking about. Because I must be able to trust the entity that I'm talking to, that they will truly not harm me on purpose, and that they will truly not harm me unintentionally. These are broad framework statements for how the restorative part of justice would apply to Lakeland. And we'll get into some more concrete measures in the next set of questions.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. And let's see, Maxine, yes, you did. You took a stab at this. How would restorative justice apply to Lakeland? And so I think just to keep the conversation going, I think, again, we're still raising and presenting thought-provoking kinds of questions and discussion. And Maxine, I will say, Ms. Gross, I will say that you did raise the Restorative Justice Commission, and that was a part of our city's resolution back in June of last year. And so that is something that is on the table. And I'm glad you've reminded us of that. And so I'm speaking as part of the council now. That is, it sounds like, well, not it sounds like, but so far the discussion of restorative justice by Dr. Turner and by Kurt might endorse such a commission. And beyond that, I'll get off my soapbox and go to the next question, which is our question number 8. Maybe you see this, maybe you don't, but there, what might be concrete restorative measures. And this is discussion, maybe this is brainstorming, but at any rate, Kurt, do you want to launch off into that question as we speak?
Yeah, I can perhaps be briefer than I've been. I'll give it a try at any rate. What might be concrete restorative measures? The first thing, of course, is ask the people who were dispossessed, ask the people who were shunted on the side, and be prepared to support them as they take authority and responsibility to right some of these wrongs. Three things that could happen. As I think about the young people whose education and opportunities were truncated because of what happened in Lakeland, is we could plan for an endowment for Lakeland's young descendants so that they could receive training. It could be formal or shorter term, university or otherwise. Training in media, arts, and history, for example, to be excellent narrative storytellers of history and truth. The impact of millennials and Generation Z youth in the videography realm, they're basically determining what we think about it, how we think in many ways. So allowing young people whose education was short-circuited to become idea definers and communicators about what happened, not just for the Lakeland community, but in the broader African-American experience. And then for us who are not African-American to discover the richness and wealth and what we owe to that culture of people. The second one would be a space and a budget for exploration and exhibition and narrative building. Instead of just a monument that sticks up somewhere, that we actually create a monument that people exist in and create things, arts, music, drama, dance. And then the third one is, again, most of these are for Lakeland young descendants, but it could be broader, is ensuring internships in companies that increase their connections for professional development. So in other words, I'm trying to take each of these things that we discussed in the theory of change or that we discussed in terms of concrete directions for restoration and healing and turning them into things that somebody needs to direct it, and we need to make sure that those are Lakeland people, that it needs to be paid for, it needs to be planned for, and it could be started and allow iterative development. So I don't think anybody on this, in this webinar, believes that we can come up with answers that last forever, but we can come up with directions that we can iterate as time changes. These would be three concrete restorative measures, in addition to the broader thing of a commission, for example. But the problem with a commission is for older people, we won't be around to see the results of it. And for young people, they don't want to be around to see the results of it. They want to see something now, today.
Okay, Kurt, I think we're doing fairly well on time. And so I'm looking at the chat box, and Ms. Barber has posted a couple of questions that I will raise and ask any of our panelists to who might want to respond to. And so one of the questions has to do with what should be the right of restitution for the Lakeland community. And anyone want to take a stab at that? Just speak up or raise your hand and I will recognize you, or just speak up. And I'll tell you what I will also do is, while you might be thinking of that question and some discussion on that question, there are two more questions which I will raise, And one says, what right did the city of College Park have to include Lakeland in its incorporation against its will? And so that question goes back to earlier days than urban renewal per se. And then the second part of that question is, how did the city justify such action? And then there's a question that says, when houses were taken, were the Lakelanders compensated? And I believe, Ms. Gross-Maxine, you did say that there were some folks who received some compensation. I don't know if you would want to say more about that or not.
I mean, I can't answer the question. They were compensated. Mm-hmm. But of course, you have to look at the circumstances a bit.
Of course.
The amount of compensation was decided upon by the city's agents. If you look at the city records, which we have had an opportunity to look at, and look at those appraisals, you can tell from them that there were some actions that were taken to paint the properties in as least favorable a light as possible. And you also need to look at the fact that by the fact that they were in an African-American community, the properties were already devalued. And you also must look at the fact that a lot of the properties were being taken because of their standing in what was felt to be, judged to be a flood-prone area. That in itself diminished the value of the properties. So I say they were, but was it a fair selling price? Some might judge that not to be the case. But yes, they were paid for their properties.
Thank you for that further explanation. Do you have a comment to make about the right of the city of College Park to include Lakeland in its incorporation against its will? You know, going back to the early days of as I remember, the city of College Park was incorporated in 1945, and so it would have been sometime, 1945 or around that time when the map was set to determine the boundaries of the city of College Park, which would to include the Lakeland community. So do you have any comments on that? Is that something that the Lakeland Heritage Project has unearthed over the years?
Actually, no.
I don't mean to put you on the spot per se, but.
Well, oral histories did tell us that Lakeland did not desire to be a part of the city when the city was incorporated. I don't know exactly what happened. I did actually very recently contact our one of our delegates to try to get the legislative history on the subject, only to find that they didn't keep legislative histories until much later in the state's history. The only thing that one of the librarians was able to find was that article that I included in my presentation today. I really don't know. And I really don't know, I just don't know. And the information may be lost to history, but some scholar may be able to unearth it, but I have not been able to find out.
That's fair. That's fair. Thank you. And did anyone come up with any response to the question, what should the right of restitution for the Lakeland community be? And if not, we'll hold that question. Okay, go ahead. Yes, thank you.
About that question. And I like to offer, and it connects to the last question around concrete restorative measures, what might they be as well? So I'd like to connect to that as well. I would say that the framework of restorative justice uses the language of responsibilities more than the language of rights. And so one way to reframe the question would be, does the city of College Park have a responsibility to offer some form of restitution to the Lakeland community? And so I would say within that framework, if restitution is something that's named as a need from those who are most impacted, and it arises from the needs that they were created from the harm, then the city of College Park would have a responsibility to meet the needs that have arisen from harm that happened, no matter how historical that harm has been, because the impacts continue. I would also say that in terms of that question, what might concrete restorative measures be? So restitution would be one of them, that the extent to which measures are deemed restorative are more so determined by the process through which they arrived, more so than kind of the mechanism itself. So for example, to give this example of a community that has been impacted, or a group who's been impacted, or an individual who hasn't been impacted, if they don't name something as this is a need or something we want, then even though someone else might say that that's restorative, if it's not named from that community, from those groups that are most impacted, then it's not necessarily restorative. So it's not a process where someone can come in from the outside and say, you know, this is what would be the best outcome in this situation. But as Dr. Rhodes mentioned, it starts by asking the people who are hurt and being prepared to listen to them, and being prepared to say, well, how can we meet those needs? How can we address the impacts that have arisen in relation to the harm that has occurred?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Turner. I'm now going to pivot back to our original set of questions and turn to Kurt or Dr. Rhodes and Maxine and ask the question, how would you suggest we could restore tangible and intangible loss created by forced displacement? And I'm going to ask Maxine to address this first, unless Dr. Rhodes, unless you have some burning thought that you'd like to also say. Okay. Maxine, would you do that one? Number 9?
Well, I'm gonna go right back to what Dr. Turner has already said. I think that's something that needs to be put to Lakelanders. That what we've asked for is a coming together of the community and the stakeholders, and that means the city of College Park, residents, the leaders of the city of College Park, Lakelanders, which is the residents of Lakeland, past and current, as well as the descendants of Lakelanders, to be able to talk about, you know, what was the harm and what do we feel are restorative measures. And I think it's been stated a number of times already. Part of the whole concept of restorative justice is really community building as well. It's what is going to make the community stronger, the Lakelanders, but also the citizens of College Park. So going through that process together, you know, has the benefit of making all elements stronger. And if we've learned nothing over the last 4 years with what we've gone through as a nation, if we don't solve our healing issues, we're going to keep continuing to relive the same harms over and over and over again. And that's the story of African Americans in this country. You know, you go to slavery, and then we go to Reconstruction, and then we go to Jim Crow, and then, you know, it's a back and forth thing where we never really make progress. And I think that's come about because we've never healed. And we've never given opportunity for everyone in the community to understand what harm has been caused and draw together to try to resolve some of that.
Okay, Dr. Rhodes, did you have anything to add? And I want to say that Maxine, you just sort of laid out part of what I would consider to be the maybe not the mission, but some of the vision of restorative justice for Lakeland and for the city of College Park. And thank you for that. That's something for us, you know, mayor and council and staff to consider going forward, I believe. Dr. Rhodes, did you have anything to add to that? And I will say that if not per se, I do have a couple of other questions in the chat box, which I will raise. And one of the questions is this specifically: have the 104 families displaced and their current descendants been identified over the years? That's one of the questions that's there in our chat box, outstanding. And Maxine, or would you want to answer that, or do you have that answer?
I cannot say that we have tracked down each and every family, no. We have made, the Lakeland Community Heritage Project has over the decade made efforts to contact as many families as we can to let them know about our efforts to preserve and share the Lakeland story. I think that is part of the process that we would need to undertake as a community to seek out those individuals and bring them into the process. But I'm going to say here, I think that this needs to be a process that the community undertakes. To this point, it's been something where the Lakeland community has done really all of the heavy lifting. I don't think that it is reasonable to expect that the individuals who were harmed should be made responsible for the curative process. And while I will speak for myself, while I am more than willing to be a strong partner, I think it's time for others in the community to step up and work as part of the team in the healing process.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And I believe that Dr. Turner has somewhat addressed and maybe even amplified your comment there. And so I'm going to turn to Dr. Turner in just a second to see if Dr. Turner, if you have a further comment. But I also wanted to raise another question that is in our chat box. And that question is, I see much more flooding in other parts of College Park, like in Old Town, than I see in Lakeland. Have there been engineering or drainage improvements that have minimized that flooding? And I can say that my knowledge of efforts following urban renewal and to eliminate the flooding in the, what we call the eastern segment of Lakeland, that is between Route 1 or Baltimore Avenue and Rhode Island Avenue. Some of the process to eliminate flooding was draining or dredging of the Paint Branch Creek in this area, and maybe even other areas. And so yes, that has taken place. And I'm going to pivot here to Council Member John Rigg, who I believe has authored this question specifically, and asked John if you care to comment or ask any further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Dennis. I did not author that specific question.
Okay. Oh,
but I had a related comment,
okay.
and it was based on a framework that I found particularly compelling, that Dr. Turner raised a moment ago about responsibility. And it was building on a thought that Ms. Gross raised in a prior conversation in which we were talking about restorative justice in the context of Lakeland. And that is, a broader, it's a suggestion that there be a broader notion of collective responsibility beyond sort of Lakelanders, the Lakeland diaspora in the city of College Park. As Ms. Gross pointed out previously, and as the presentations today emphasized, the city of College Park in 1969, as it is still today, is in a sort of complex intergovernmental and multi-stakeholder ecosystem. And the successor governments today still bear responsibility in addition to the city of College Park, and I think should probably be at the table. As Ms. Gross pointed out in a prior presentation, a substantial portion of what was then Eastern Lakeland is now Maryland National Capital Park and Planning land, and a substantial portion, and a substantial player in the political ecosystem of College Park in 1969 as today is the University of Maryland, for whom many Lakelanders worked, according to Ms. Gross's book. So I guess as we consider, next steps, I think it's important that the city continue to acknowledge our responsibility and our responsibility to help in the process of restorative justice and accountability. However, I would also call on these other stakeholders, in particular Prince George's County, MNC, PPC, and the University of Maryland to join us at the table and talk about addressing, these oppressions that occurred almost 50 years ago in a more holistic fashion and in a way that could bring additional perspectives, but also additional resources and additional measures to the table.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rigg. And I need to go back and correct something that I said in introducing that question about flooding and any engineering activity. I described the area around Paint Branch Creek, which was dredged, as the eastern area. I should have described that as the western area. And I'll just say that in discussions about the Lakeland community going back to prior to urban renewal, the area that is now Lake Artemisia was part of the residential area that Ms. Gross described earlier, and that was the western. No, that's right.
The eastern.
That was the eastern, and where we are, the area between Rhode Island Avenue and Baltimore Avenue, Route 1, is the eastern.
Western
area, yeah. All right, I'm going to stop, and and ask if there are, so let me just summarize by saying that we have exhausted our list of questions that we wanted to have some discussion about. And so I would just like to go back to our panelists to ask, and I'll thank you in advance, but ask if there is any of the discussion that has raised some burning thought in your mind that you would like to state as we speak. So it's a open forum for any panelist to maybe further discuss something that we discussed during the questioning and discussion, or, well, I won't say anything else, but almost anything else.
I'm going to pick up on something that Maxine said repeatedly, and that was the three-letter word, ask. We need to ask and be prepared to listen. I think that we should plan to do something within weeks, not even a year. And the first thing we could do is ask those people who were present what it was. And the way we would ask is to take younger descendants of Lakeland and train them how to ask the questions and how to take the video, so that immediately we're in touch with people to ask them, and we're creating a capacity in the community to do the asking and the recording. And this, I say, in the backdrop of the number of African-American scholars who are writing about these injustices, and the number of non-African-American scholars who are also writing about it. It becomes impossible to ignore. And Lakeland, you could say one of the adjectives for that describes it is ignored and unimportant, not because they are unimportant, because they were ignored. So I would say it's very important to continue creating the story, continue asking, and involve young descendants of Lakeland people to do this work. It's not rocket science to do videos and interview. The art is in people who have experience talking to young people so that they can do it themselves. That would give us something definitely to do right away, and definitely following up on the one three-letter word that Maxine has mentioned over and over and over to us.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rhodes or Kurt. And so I want to try to stick to our end time. And so we have 10 minutes left, unless there are some real burning questions. I will say at this time, again, to our audience, our attendees, if you have questions or even comments that you would like for us to be aware of, you may send an email to families@collegeparkmd.gov, and we'll make every attempt to respond to those, especially those which might be unanswered via our discussion of questions that came up into the chat. And then also I want to again emphasize that the Lakeland Community Heritage Project has a website, or a website, and that is lakelandchp.com. I have placed that link in our in the chat box. And then also, it was mentioned that at the beginning that this session is being recorded. for later viewing and for later use. And so it is our intent to make this and other videos in our community conversations sessions available through our website, which is www.collegeparkmd.gov. And again, I just would like to say to our panelists, thank you very much. I think it's very engaging conversation. As I have said earlier, thought-provoking and lots of food for thought. And from my perspective, I believe that is, we have met many of the goals of this discussion. And I would just end with, there's more work to be done. And at this point, I'm going to go over to the mayor and maybe some other council people might have just a closing comment. So, Mr. Mayor, if you're...
Thank you. I'd be happy to close, but I did see Ms. Mitchell and Mr. Day have their hands up. So maybe
I didn't notice that. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Monroe. I first want to say thank you to the panelists. Each and every one of you definitely brought a thought-provoking perspective about this whole subject matter. And going to what Ms. Gross talked about, the ask. When we say the ask and we're talking to people across the table, I hope there is a willingness to actually listen, to be still and listen to the words that are being expressed. We can go through the execution and exercise, but if we're not still and willing to receive the positive and especially the negative, we will have succeeded in accomplishing nothing. So that is my heartfelt hope, is that when the ask is brought to us, that we are really willing to sit and listen. Listen with an open heart and mind. That's all.
All right, well, first I want to say thank you to our panelists, because there's a couple of reasons why I think this is a very timely, very informative session that we've had tonight. You have brought to the table a lot of items to think about for us, and I'll tell you why. For me, I wanted to hear from people who understand what restorative justice is and how and what shape it really takes, and how we could possibly apply this in the city of College Park. So what I will say is, within the next couple of weeks, on our council will be discussing the actual commission. And I think you have given us a great bit of information to understand what our charter will need to be for the commission. I think that is something that is you know, we're going to listen, and we want to make sure we do our best to get it right. Maxine and a lot of others have asked us to create a commission to address these issues. So I think the fact that we're going to discuss this, I think it's the first week of February. I'm a little, it's within the next couple of weeks. And I think we have a great deal of information to help us to think about how do we want to shape the commission and where do we want to drive this issue from. And I think the panelists have given us all sorts of directions to go in, but I think as a council, I think we can work with, you know, the Lakeland community and figure out how do we, the creation of, what is it going to, what is the build of the commission and what is the direction the commission, we're going to ask them to, you know, look at how the issue is to be developed. So I want to thank you guys for that. And I really look forward to this because it's a long time coming and I think it is very needed. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to say one other thing before we close, and Mr. Mayor, I will come back to you. County Council Member Danielle Glaros was on, and she was the author of the question about the 104 displaced families that Maxine answered. But Councilmember Glaros had to leave the conversation, and she has sent us a message that she would like some follow-up from some subset of this group here. So I'll make that known. And I just want to say again that in looking at the attendee list, early on, I saw that there were 45 people in the attendee list, in addition to the number of panelists and council people and staffers who were on. So I believe that is a good, if you will, turnout. And so hopefully we have gotten a lot of food for thought. And with that, Mr. Mayor, I will turn off my moderator hat, and you might close us out.
Thank you, Mr. Dennis. Thank you again to the panelists, to the Lakeland Community Heritage Project. Ms. Gross, thank you for all the work that you've put into this. You're right, this should not be a burden that the people who have been forced to suffer through these many years to carry. This is a burden that we as a city need to take on. This was a continuance of the conversation. The conversation will, as Mr. Day said, we will be discussing this as a council and the establishment of a restorative justice commission. I have a few thoughts of myself about how we move forward, but I do think primarily we need to be deliberative. We need to be focused. We need to be open to what the Lakeland community, both those who are there currently and those who have been displaced from Lakeland over the years, have to say. And as Ms. Mitchell very succinctly put it, we need to listen. It needs to be community driven. So I look forward to that continued conversation. It's long overdue. I appreciate the work that everybody is doing to make sure that we move that forward. So thank you again once again to our panelists, to the council members, and everybody who was in attendance. And thank you to Mr. Dennis for moderating the forum. And please stay tuned and stay engaged. Thank you and have a good night.
Hi, Maria. You're muted.
I was copying that one link from the speaker from Eastern Mennonite College because she was wonderful, but she talked so fast I couldn't get it all down. So yeah, I really enjoyed just everything that everybody said in it. It really helps to understand what restorative justice really is, and I think that's really important to progressing. You know, we need to understand what it is and then listen to the community and listen